The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Jesus said to Nicodemus, "Just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the desert, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, so that everyone who believes in him may have eternal life. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that everyone who believes in him might not perish, but might have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world might be saved through him. Whoever believes in him will not be condemned, but whoever does not believe has already been condemned, because he has not believed in the name of the only Son of God. And this is the verdict, that the light came into the world, but people preferred darkness to light, because their works were evil. For everyone who does wicked things hates the light, and does not come toward the light, so that his works might not be exposed. But whoever lives the truth comes to the light, so that his works may be clearly seen as done in God." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you. I never knew my grandfather on my mother's side very well. Grandpa Floyd died when I was 7 years old. I remember him vaguely. But my family has told me many stories about my grandfather, and so he's come alive in my mind. I know, for example, that my grandfather Floyd grew up on a dairy farm in Wisconsin, that he was fortunate enough to be chosen to go to Annapolis, the Naval Academy, in the 20s. He was part of the Navy, and he fought to defend our country in World War II. He fought in Okinawa, and I'm told that it affected him for the rest of his life. I know that my grandfather had 3 wonderful daughters, one of whom was my mother, and the other 2 my aunts. He loved his wife Edith. He had many demons that he struggled with his whole life long. And despite that, he loved much, and he loved his family. He had a good job. He was an executive at a crane company in Milwaukee. And he was a good man. My grandfather Floyd was baptized and raised a Presbyterian Christian. And he remained a Presbyterian Christian for the rest of his life. And he loved God. Now, when my grandparents were married, this would be in the 1930s, some 80 years ago, because it was a mixed marriage between a Catholic, my grandmother, and a non-Catholic, my grandfather, this was a rare thing. It's not as common as it is today. And so, when they were married in the church, my grandfather had to make a promise. And the promise that he had to make was that the children that came from that marriage would be raised in the Catholic faith. A similar promise is made today, although it's somewhat changed. But the same promise exists today when there's a mixed marriage. So my grandfather made a promise, and he kept that promise. He didn't go to church very much himself, I'm told. But when it came time for his daughters to be raised Catholics, he sent them to a Catholic school. And I'm told that every Sunday morning, he would take my grandmother and the 3 kids to Mass, drop them off, go home and start breakfast, come back and pick them up an hour later, bring them home, and breakfast would be ready. It's not a bad deal if you can get it. Because my grandfather, Floyd, kept his promise 80 years ago, my mother was raised a Catholic. Because my mother was raised a Catholic, I was raised a Catholic. And because I was raised a Catholic, when God called me to be a priest, I was able to say yes. And so in a very real way, the reason I stand before you here this morning is because my Presbyterian grandfather, who was a good man, kept his promise. He kept his promise. I hope to meet him someday. It will be wonderful. God does work in mysterious ways. God writes straight with crooked lines, as we say. We hear about a similar story in our first reading today. The Jewish people, the chosen people, were blessed by God with many, many, many things. King David, the great king, Solomon after him, they had built the temple, the dwelling place of God amongst his people. There was peace on every side, riches. The Jewish people were growing. Things were going well. But gradually, over the generations, they began to drift and started to take God for granted and were lulled by their peace and security. And some of the leaders, the kings of Israel, started worshiping false gods or going after the pagan gods of the surrounding area. And they began to fall away from the Lord. And God was not pleased with this. So in his mercy and in his justice, he allowed the chosen people to be punished and to suffer. And the suffering was very severe. The Babylonian Empire came in, took over the Jewish people, destroyed the temple, and exiled them far away from their land. A complete disaster. There are entire books of the Old Testament written just talking about this disaster. It was awful. And many of the Jewish people thought that this was the end. God had abandoned them, life was over, it was a complete and total disaster. But the hand of God writes. The hand of God is at work. God writes straight with crooked lines. Eventually the Babylonians were taken over by the Persians. And a Persian king named Cyrus came into his kingdom and saw the Jewish people and said, in effect, "Why are they here? They should be sent home back where they came from. In fact, I so much want them to go home, I'll rebuild the temple for them." The Jewish people could hardly believe their ears. They were allowed to go back to their homeland. Cyrus rebuilt their temple, and things were well again for a time. God writes straight with crooked lines. Who would have thought that things would have worked that way? It's amazing. But that's what happened. And similar things happen in our lives too. What do we mean when God writes straight with crooked lines? I think what that means is that seemingly when we look at our lives, things are all over the place. Sometimes we're good, sometimes we're not so good. Sometimes we're very faithful, sometimes we fall away. We have successes, we have failures. Things work out great, then we hit a wall. And yet through all of this, as we look back upon our lives, we see that God has been writing the story, and that the roadblocks that tragically you and I sometimes put in his way, he always seems to get around them. And that's why we're here this morning, are we not? God works in mysterious ways, and he writes straight with crooked lines. And God's mercy is extended to all of us, and the Lord is writing the story of our lives. Struggles do come, sufferings do come. Death of a loved one, difficulties in our marriage, loss of a job, struggles with addictions. Sometimes we feel like a failure. Sometimes we feel ashamed because we think that we've abandoned God. Oftentimes in life we wonder where we're going, or where we're headed, or what's going on, or where is God in all of this? How many times have we asked a similar question to that? And yet, if we're honest, if we look back upon our lives, maybe we don't see God at this moment, this morning. Maybe our minds are filled with struggles and difficulties or confusion. But if we look back a month, 6 months, a year, 5 years, 10 years. Look at where we were and look at where we are now. And we will see how God has worked, and indeed how he has carried us along the way, and how he hasn't abandoned us, and how he's loved us through all of these things. And if we're struggling right now, let's trust that he will guide us through this at this moment. And if things are going very well for us now, we thank God for it. But God's right straight with crooked lines. And the challenge for all of us is to be open to it. We may not understand why the things happen to us the way they do in our life today, now. Friends, family, job, health, whatever it may be. It may be a mystery for us, even to the end of our lives. We may not understand why it happened the way it did. But can we have faith to trust that God, who loves us, has brought us this far? He's not going to abandon us. He's not. We wear rose-colored vestments because this is the fourth Sunday of Lent, Laetare Sunday. Rose symbolizes rejoicing. We're halfway through the Lenten season, halfway to Easter, the cause of our joy. So we are a little more rosy today, and the readings reflect that. And remember, it's not pink, it's rose. Remember that. Or salmon, as somebody said. We have reason to rejoice. We do. God works in mysterious ways. He does. And God writes straight with crooked lines. Let's trust him more, and know that in our lives, no matter what we're going through, the good or the bad, joys or sorrows, ups or downs, successes, failures, no matter what, the Lord loves us, he's guiding us, and we have every reason to rejoice. May God bless you.